The most common mistake that I see every time is that people think they can open up a company in, let's call it in any of your Channel Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, and that will all of a sudden lead to reduction in their tax exposure overall. I think that's the largest misconception. Having a company in a specific jurisdiction helps you nothing. The practical part of it is you've got to think about the fact that you're operating in various different jurisdictions with cross-jurisdictionality that plays in, which means there are different rules that apply in different jurisdictions at different times, and they all have their own sort of unique impact and unique flavor that they add to your entire corporate structure. Makes it slightly tricky is that certain jurisdictions apply certain principles slightly differently, and it means that you've got to take quite a flexible approach, and to try and integrate a global structure can at times be quite difficult because you sit with different jurisdictions across the world operating differently, and that ultimately sort of have different impacts on your business, but that you need to integrate in one sort of driver and one business that functions uniformly from a client perspective. The one mistake that groups often make, especially when they start off building a global structure, is you usually have a company in one or two jurisdictions, and then you think to yourself, okay, but we're growing internationally. It's a great time now to branch out and build a global structure. And the first thing that people usually put at the forefront is tax. Say, oh, should we now start looking at jurisdictions, that are perhaps slightly more competitive? My advice typically is to not do it that way, but to rather, the focus should be on your commercials. Think about your business, think about where you want your business to be in 5 or 10 years. What is your end goal? Are you wanting to build a business that you are going to live off of and that you want to pass on to future generations? Or are you trying to build something that you want to sell? Those questions will ultimately inform where you go with your business, which jurisdictions you choose, and how you choose to operate with the business. Which means that ultimately what you do is you put your commercials at the forefront, and after that, within the realm of the commercials that you're trying to achieve, you work towards the tax and see how you can optimize your tax position within those commercials, rather than doing it the other way around, which is what a lot of people often do, and I think where people slip up slightly. One of the first things that businesses should do when they're building international structures for themselves and they're moving into different jurisdictions is it works quite well in the transfer pricing world. They call it a functional analysis, and I think that works from a business perspective as well. It's almost like a little business plan that you do for each specific jurisdiction to say, well, if we're going to be moving into that jurisdiction, what is it that we need in that specific jurisdiction from a resources perspective? What do we need from equipment, assets, people, buildings? What are those types of requirements that we need to operate efficiently within a specific jurisdiction? And then to build your business model around those types of needs of the business. Oftentimes people have this idea of, these so-called shell companies. You'll see them very often in mainstream media. People talk about shell companies in tax haven jurisdictions. And what they really are is just a post box. I would, advise to refrain from that as much as possible. The crisp thing that you should try and do is to look at what is it that you need optimally to drive that business in that jurisdiction, and principally, in as far as possible, have people in that jurisdiction. Oftentimes these sort of post box companies, their biggest letdown is that they don't have any substance because they don't have any people there. And from a substance perspective, I think your people are your first drivers, and then from that spans, the resources that you might require in country, depending on what business you operate. The most common mistake that I see every time is that people think they can open up a company in, let's call it in any of your Channel Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, and which are competitive tax jurisdictions, and that will all of a sudden lead to significant tax reduction in their tax exposure overall. I think that's the largest misconception. Having a company in a specific jurisdiction helps you nothing. Really, what you need to do if you want to set up a successful business in a jurisdiction, you need to have some form of presence there. You need to have people there. It comes back to the idea of substance. And then secondly, you need to have a goal in mind with that specific jurisdiction. Why are you going there? Is there something for you there other than just tax? Things that people don't think about, time zones. If you're operating like in a Namibia, South African environment, English, is that something that's important to your business? Do you need people that can speak English fluently, and does your jurisdiction of choice offer that? Oftentimes people want to go to jurisdictions that they perceive are very tax friendly or so-called low tax jurisdictions, but they don't think of the other repercussions that come with it, nor do they think of the practical elements that they need to put in place to ensure that they actually utilize the jurisdiction optimally. So the repatriation of profits typically involve, you've set up in let's call it in a multi-jurisdictional organization, you've set up in different countries, and at the end of the day, usually, how the perfect structure would look is that you'll have some form of holding company or holding structure that holds your assets in the across the various jurisdictions. What the repatriation involves is saying, well, we've got profits in these distinct countries. How do we make sure that we can bring those profits back to our holding entity, either for reinvestments or to give back to shareholders in value? Two things that often happen there. The first is that's usually the form of bringing back those funds is usually in one of two ways. It's either dividends that flows from your underlying subsidiary to your holding company, or the repayment of loans. Oftentimes these subsidiaries are funded through debt. And so usually what you try and do is you try and clear the debt as quickly as possible. So repay that debt to your holding company or to your shareholders, and that effectively allows you to then start off on a clean slate. Everything else that you want to repatriate thereafter to shareholders, you typically do in the form of dividends. What people don't think about is, withholding taxes. So dividends, typically in the context of debt, we have interest-bearing arrangements. You have withholding tax on interest. You won't have withholding tax on your capital amount, but you'll have withholding tax on the interest component. And in the context of dividends, you'll have dividends withholding tax. From a tax perspective, those are the two things that you always need to think about, and trying to optimize yourself in terms of how you settle or give back shareholder value where you have debt arrangements in place, or whether you choose to do it through these sort of passive means, which is in the form of dividends. What's quite important as well that people forget about is exchange control. We see it often in African countries. Sometimes it's not a question of wanting, how do we give shareholder value back? Do we repay our loan, or do we declare a dividend? It's how do we do it? Because exchange control oftentimes just blocks in certain cases blocks the repatriation of funds. And so that's quite a key before investing in a jurisdiction, putting your money in, trying to think about the long game, which is how do I get my money out. You need to think about exchange control, and you can't ignore that as a factor. An ideal structure, in my opinion, is a centralized holding company with subsidiaries in the different jurisdictions in which you operate, or a company that holds shares in companies that in the different jurisdictions in which the entity operates. So let's take, for example, we'll have great holding company jurisdiction just generally throughout the world is the United Kingdom. Why? The UK is a very reputable jurisdiction. It stays pretty consistent over time, and it doesn't have dividends with withholding tax, making it quite a good jurisdiction as a holding entity. It will then hold shares in the different entities that operate throughout the world. So let's say you are in a mining industry and you operate in 3 African countries. Your perfect structure would be to have a holding company in the UK that owns shares in the different countries, and owns shares that are in companies that are incorporated in the different countries in which you operate. Additionally, things you want to think about, you've mentioned it now, is IPCO, your IP. My suggestion would typically be to have that housed in a separate entity held by the holding company. Why do I say that? Well, oftentimes it may be that companies build up substantial value in their IP, and that's something that they might want to sell. And having that in a holding company is not necessarily ideal, because you've got it cross-mixed with other classes of assets. Additionally, having a centralized holding company is useful not only for reinvesting throughout your different jurisdictions or into new jurisdictions, but also for bringing in shareholders. It provides a central point in which all your shareholders can really effectively share and take part in the business as a whole, with that holding company being sort of the nest egg, the vehicle that holds all the assets throughout the world. In conclusion, when you're looking at an international structure, I typically say to clients, you're looking at 4 to 5 big ticket items. The first is you're looking at the treaty networks that exist between your different entities or the different jurisdictions in which you are operating, and how strong those treaty networks are, and what their relationship is between the different countries. The second thing that you want to focus on is ensuring that, and people often get this one or miss this one, is that the countries in which you are incorporated in is also where you want to ensure that your tax residency remains. And typically, if you look at the way the global forces work insofar as how one determines residency, you typically look at things such as place of effective management to determine where entities are tax resident. So just incorporating an entity in a jurisdiction doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be tax resident there. Something I think that often catches companies is that they think that their tax obligation only arises in the country in which they're incorporated or in which they're situated. And that's certainly not the case. It can be so, and we often see that in the context of South African companies, Namibian companies even more so, that people are established, formed, they have their so-called tax residency in, let's say, South Africa or in Namibia, but they operate in 4 or 5 other neighboring countries, Zambia, Swaziland, in a South African context, very close by, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola, in a Namibian context. That your tax responsibility will also more than likely arise in countries which you are operating in. And so therefore it's very important for companies to be acutely aware of which jurisdictions they're operating in and to understand whether they do have a tax obligation in those jurisdictions, aside from the jurisdiction in which they are incorporated or principally formed in. The other very important thing, and we've mentioned it already, is exchange control. And because exchange control impacts how your funds flow, in which mechanisms you can use for the flow of funds or to repatriate funds, as we've mentioned, but also most importantly, whether you can get your funds out of a specific jurisdiction. And that impacts ultimately how you view your structure as a whole. And lastly, and the one I think that catches most people, is your source basis of taxation. So most countries in the world have some form of a source basis of taxation, either exclusively or sort of in a quasi form with a residency basis of taxation. What I mean by that is, if you have a presence in a country, it's more than likely that that country will want to tax you based on that presence. And therefore, a portion of the profits of your company that is being generated might be taxable in a jurisdiction other than the jurisdiction in which it's resident, because it operates in another jurisdiction. And that source basis of taxation is a very important mechanism, or very important principle to keep in mind. Firstly, because it creates administrative burdens for companies, meaning that they will need to adhere to laws not only in the country of which they are incorporated, but also in the one in which they're operating. And secondly, because it determines taxing rights. And so the country to which you might need to have some form of a tax bill isn't necessarily always exclusively the country in which you're incorporated.